Who remembers something from that? Anyone recalls? Tatsam, Kushi, Riddhi. What did we discuss?
Sir,
Yeah.
sir, give me one day. I will understand it again by watching the recording because, like from 2 days, I was at Oro University.
Okay.
So I didn't able to attend your class properly. So
Okay.
give me 2 days. I will understand it properly.
Okay. Maybe tomorrow, in tomorrow's class, we may have some questions. Anyone else? Kushi, Riddhi. Kushi, Riddhi, were you present in the previous class?
Yes, sir, we were.
Yeah.
So
So,
he,
do you remember something?
yeah, I mean the bit that I
Hmm.
understood. So he talked
Yeah, that's
about
fine.
class distinction,
Hmm.
and he thought he, according to him, class was a value, and just a second. He talked about dominant class putting forward their opinions and what they believed in front of the society. Then class conflict and commodity fetish.
Okay. And what else? You are right.
Then there was hegemony, where the dominant class exerts its influence, be it on social, cultural, or economical aspects.
And what do you mean by hegemony?
So dominance of one
Dominant.
social. Hello,
Yeah.
am I audible, sir?
Yeah. Go ahead, Riddhi.
Yes, sir. So dominance of one social group over the other is hegemony.
Okay. That is one understanding. That's the dictionary meaning of word hegemony. Now we have to remember in critical theory and literary criticism classes, we are looking at a certain form of specializations, right? And all forms of specializations, whether it's medicine or law, have their own terminological jargon, right? Which means that the language is used in slightly different way than we use in everyday life. So when we are looking at theory, we have to understand that the terminology of theory and literary criticism has a distinctive kind of vocabulary. And hegemony, though in everyday meaning it means dominance, it has slightly different meaning in Marxist, especially Gramscian thought. So does anyone remember how hegemony is different from dominance?
So, in hegemony, they make the others accept their values and everything voluntarily, like
Right.
with their consent. And in
Right.
dominance, they put forward like they use power to make the others accept their ideas. I think
Right.
that's what the difference
You
is.
are almost right, except for the term power, right? Power does not only mean muscle power or money power. It also means power of ideas that are, uh, one way of doing it is to force somebody to accept ideas. That is imposition, right? But hegemony means you try to develop a consensus, persuade people, convince people that your ideas are the best ideas for the society. And that is what we mean by hegemony in Gramscian terms, right? And Gramsci is explaining how ideology of ruling class or the dominant class becomes the ideology of the entire society, right? And which gives rise to uh, some form of consent among the people who are dominated, the class that is dominated, right? So dominated class voluntarily comes to accept uh, superiority or accept that these ideas are best for us, right? That is what Gramsci means by hegemony. Okay, good. Anything else? I think Kushi mentioned commodity fetish. So what do you remember of that?
So I think it means the intrinsic value of the product, like the economic or social. I mean, the
Okay.
like the workforce or labor force
Pardon, come
applied.
again, come again. Can you repeat?
The labor or workforce.
Not exactly, but you are reaching there. You are
Okay.
almost there. What he means by commodity fetish is that the price of the product, right? Say, for example, the cost that your cell phone has, right? And you think that it's the product that has value, right? Product has a price. While it is, according to Marx, the labor that is put into making of that product, right? So what happens is that when you start relating price to the product, right, it gets as if the product has its own value. Price becomes value, right? Price is transformed into value. There's a difference between price and value, right, Kushi?
Yes, sir.
And what happens is that the question of labor and exploitation, which is the fundamental mechanism of capitalism, is hidden. It is concealed. That you don't see it as a product of exploitation of somebody's labor, but you see as if it has got inherent intrinsic value, right? And that creates a kind of aura around it, something very similar to branding or something that you have seen. So brands are very often examples of commodity fetish. Yeah, welcome Shikha. Hi. So we are
Sorry.
just revising some
Yeah.
basics of Marxism.
Okay.
So we discuss what is hegemony and what is commodity fetish.
Okay.
Anything else that you remember from Marxism?
Superstructures. I mean,
Superstructure, okay. Base and superstructure. And
yeah.
what about that?
Uh, I mean, so like I mean not related, sorry, but like this question came up to me yesterday. I
Hmm.
was reading Terry Eagleton's essay, and I mean that and Marxism. I was reading upon it, and like everywhere, um, like there was this assumption that art and literature can be used to influence the people, and basically that thought, and I sort of agreed with it. So but yesterday in our new literatures class we discussed about the progressive writers movement in India.
Okay.
So it just made me think that if we look at it from a Marxist perspective, then does what the progressive writers wrote to rouse the nation, or does it also count as Marxist? I mean, but then I asked my professor that, and she said that like Marxism is applicable to a, like I don't remember what she said, something about it being a volatile state and or a non-volatile state. I'm not sure, but how it was not completely applicable here, but that literature, media, and art was is always a part of Marxist ideology. So I just like I mean yesterday that was pretty like self-explanatory, but then I started thinking about it more, and I thought like I could ask you this to like completely understand if we can look at something happening in India with a Marxist perspective. Is looking at the progressive writers movement, considering it a part of a Marxist thought, even if it wasn't, like considering it that way because we were using literature and poems to uh, make people think or influence them in a way, even if it was not the, I mean, okay, yeah. So, I mean, it's also written that the bourgeoisie thought, that is the dominant thought, is like via literature is used to influence the people, uh, but then this was not primarily dominant thought, but they wanted to make it that, I suppose, in the progressive writers movement. So could we consider it part of? I mean, is what I was thinking.
Actually, I don't know if you have noticed it, but you have combined two questions. Yeah,
Yeah.
right. So I will separate them for you. Can you
Okay.
separate them?
No, no, no. Please go.
Would you try, like to try?
No, no. I think I'll just get more confused if I start again. So,
So one is progressive movement in India influenced by Marxism? Does it carry certain ideas from Marxism in their view of literature and their practice and their theory of art? That is one question. The second question is, can we read it? Can we read progressive literature or any other literature in India or literary movement in India using Marxist framework? Now, these are two separate questions, right? And it's very easy to confuse them, right? And that's why this is a very good question that you asked, because this is a common confusion that happens. Marxist way of reading can be applicable according to the Marxist theory to any kind of modern literary phenomena, according to them, across the world, right? And it has to be modified to its context, but it can be applied. That is one thing. Secondly, you can even use Marxist framework to analyze movements that are not necessarily Marxist. For example, T.S. Eliot, Yeats, Conrad, Dickens, all these texts are not influenced by Marxist thought. Hardy, uh, George Eliot, and Matthew Arnold. None of these authors are influenced by Marxism. But even then, Terry Eagleton analyzes their theory and practice in the context of Marxist thought, using Marxist way of reading. So Marxism, in one way, is a methodology of interpretation, asking a particular set of questions to texts which may or may not be Marxist in their orientation. They are not influenced by Marxism, right? So Marxist, that's the second question that you have asked, right? So you can analyze any modern phenomena using Marxism combined with certain modifications that we will discuss later. But you can. That is first answer to your second question. Progressive movements were self-consciously influenced by Marxism, right? Especially after Russian Revolution of 1917 and the rise of urban industrial capitalism, trade union movements gained ground. And many of the progressive writers were influenced, like the trade union leaders, with Marxist thought. Because Marxism has a deep impact on trade union movement, because in some way it is an attempt to theorize trade union movements, right, which demand their equal justice against the industrial capitalist class, right? So in terms of wages, or in terms of quality of work, in terms of labor, in terms of other forms of justice. So progressive writers were a school of writers influenced by Marxism. You can think of Mulkraj Anand, you can think of Ismat Chugtai and Faiz Ahmad Faiz and Premchand. These are some of the important writers, right? There were many, but these are some of them. And Manto kind of in and out of the movement. He refused to accept it as a kind of official policy. He says that writer has to be free of any ideological baggage. He has to be honest to his art and vision of life. So he was but what he wrote was something that progressives appreciated because of progressive inherent value in his writings, right? And this relates to George Lukács, whom we talked about in our general discussion class, who makes a distinction between social realism or socialist realism and critical realism. Critical realism is a form of realism which may or may not be influenced by Marxist thought, but still is critical of the social structures and politics, right? So Manto's writing had that critical value, though he may or may not be influenced by Marxist theory per se, right? So progressive writers were a group of people who were overtly accepting Marxism. And so their cornerstone of their idea is that literature can be a weapon or an instrument for promoting ideas of social justice and promoting their own ideology, propaganda, right? So they thought that art is a form of propaganda of Marxism, right? Something which probably Manto resisted. So propagandism was one of the aspects of progressive movements, and they were overtly influenced by Marxist thought, right? So that's the answer to your second question. So first question. So going back to your second question, you can even read conservative writers who are not critical of society, right? Who uphold conservative values using Marxist lens. Right, so he reads Matthew Arnold in that mode, and T.S. Eliot, W.B. Yeats. None of these can be called progressive writers. In fact, they were very, very politically conservative writers and thinkers, right? And Terry Eagleton analyzes them in the historical context of class conflicts and class dynamics. Right, but good question. Any more questions about Marxism? Anything else that you remember?
Like just a follow-up question. Can we actually write, like as Manto says, without having any ideology influences? Is it possible?
No. What I meant was any official ideology.
Okay,
and,
okay.
Some school has an ideology now. He says that artists cannot be bound down by that. Mm-hmm. But That is again an ideology in itself, right?
Yeah.
Itself an ideology. Though he has a kind of humanist ideology, and he is definitely influenced by progressive thought as a critique of society. So critical humanism may be the term that you may use to describe his ideology, right?
Okay.
So which looks at human beings as in a critical way, right? Which may not be directly in terms of Marxist, because for him, gender and sexuality and communalism were the key issues that seemed to, and he was looking at human beings' sexual life in a certain way, something that would maybe also reveal his interest. I am not sure of that in psychoanalysis and Freudianism, right? Which is also possible. Shikha, do you have questions about this essay that you studied? Because it's not an easy reading, right?
Yeah, it is not easy at
But
all.
you know what? In order to develop yourself, you develop by reading difficult texts. And that is one of the things that you have come here to develop, train yourself, develop yourself in methods and skills of reading, decoding difficult texts,
Yeah.
right? So that's the part of the game. So it's
Yeah.
fine if you have not understood. So you can ask the questions related
Yeah.
to that if you want.
So, so when I was reading the essay, I got that he was like taking into account the historicity, or about how he was taking into account every author he discussed. He took in account their class and how it affected how their ideology affected their work of writing. So I got that he kept like doing it for every author. But then I personally felt that somewhere while I got lost in some of his words, because I got the point where he wrote about how they belong. Suppose for Iliad, she's like the daughter of a farm, so like her social uh, background is from a rural area, and so he talks about how she can still see social structures in like in her rural background. But I kind of got lost as to, I couldn't relate it with the title of the essay for a while, because I felt it was very heavy. But then I was discussing it with Riddhi, and she like sent me some reference materials for the same. And there was this one, it was this comment on ideology and literary form by Francis Mulhern. And I read that, and like it made me understand it better at least. So, yeah, my main question, I don't know if one can have questions about this, because then I went
You
and,
can have all sorts of questions, even if they sound silly. You should go ahead with them. And
my first question was this as
you have
to,
in-one license, like I have, to ask stupid questions.
I mean, uh,
Why
I
does
mean,
apple fall down? इतना stupid question भी हो सकता है.
huh. Like once I don't know, I got the basic idea that he used their class to define how they wrote their work. But then there was so much of radicalism, humanism, and different movements that I've not even heard about. So then it became difficult to understand how a certain author's ideology was built up. Suppose for Dickens, we've studied him, I could understand it a bit better. Or Conrad, we read Heart of Darkness. So then maybe I could get when he talked about it being cyclical and how he considers it to be a criminal background, criminal organization of sorts, imperial society. So I sort of understood that. But then if we're talking about James Joyce or I don't know, George Eliot. I've not exactly read them or studied them. So when he spoke about movements they were part of, or political scenarios related to them, it was very confusing. So yeah, so
See,
I guess I just need to read more maybe.
One of the advantages of reading this is that you get to brush up, you get to sharpen your understanding of English literary tradition,
Mhm.
right? Which is your in some way primary subject area. right, in some way. So you enhance your understanding of English literary tradition in its historical context, right? Something that this essay provides. So whether you are studying Marxism or no Marxism, this is a kind of advantage that it develops your understanding of the subject. It deepens, right? Coming to the question, coming to the statement that you made in the beginning, that how does ideology affect a particular writer, right? And one of the difficulties of this essay is that he is using Marxism, but at the same time critically modifying some of its assumptions. He is offering a critique of Marxism as well. Some of the very core ideas of Marxism, he is modifying them critically, right? And one of the idea that he is modifying is that literature is not simply a reflection of its ideology. Literature also produces ideology, right? It is also a form of production, and this is where he takes from Althusser the idea of ideology as a form of reproducing the ideas. So it is a productive activity. Ideology is not there and literature reflects it merely, but literature itself produces ideology, right? And he uses the term called ideology of the text. He repeats this phrase. So ideology of text is something that is not mere reflection of pre-existing ideology of the author, right? And similarly, he's also complicating or questioning the idea that you can reduce a author's writing to his or her social conditions or his or her own social location. Which class does she belong? What, where does she come from? Where does, what is his location in terms of rural-urban divide? All that, he is refusing to reduce art to its basis. In some way, the question that you asked about superstructure, right? You cannot reduce superstructure simply to base, right? So he is critical of what you may call vulgar Marxism in that sense, right? So these things make reading of this essay slightly difficult.
Yeah.
Right? And he's also drawing upon some of the ideas of Gramsci, and though we discussed idea of hegemony, you have to get that Gramsci also talks about organic intellectuals and traditional intellectuals. Organic intellectuals are those intellectuals who belong to that class. They come from that class. They are the intellectual leaders of that class. For example, working class, right? Then there are intellectuals and thinkers who belong to working class, like probably D.H. Lawrence, right? Who himself came from working class, whose father was a laborer in that, worker. So organic intellectuals are people who come from the class which they lead. And that can also be coming from the bourgeoisie.
No.
Right? The middle class, by bourgeoisie we mean the class which believes in upward mobility through financial progress. That's what we mean by bourgeoisie, right? And those who own the means of production. So there is a distinction between petty bourgeoisie and richer bourgeoisie. So petty bourgeoisie are people who are maybe owning small shops or pan kathela or what smaller kind of businesses, or they may be bureaucrats, or they may be teachers or whatever. So petty bourgeoisie is the Marxist term to describe those middle class people who may not own lot of property or means of production. They don't own factories. They are not industrialists, but they are still bourgeoisie, right? So whether the author belongs to petty bourgeoisie or traditionalists, right? And traditional intellectuals are the intellectuals of the class which is on decline, like the aristocratic class in England is on decline, bourgeoisie is on rise, and working class is being exploited by the bourgeoisie for moving ahead, right? So traditional intellectuals are intellectuals belonging to the aristocratic class, the feudal aristocratic landowning maybe class, like Mr. Darcy, right? While there are others who are bourgeoisie. So that is the social structure that you have to be aware of. So author may come from any of these background like D.H. Lawrence, but his ideology that he produces, his text produces, the ideology of the text, may not be a simple reflection of his class position, right? So he is questioning some of the coreism or simplistic reductive understanding of Marxism. He is critiquing that.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So literature is not a passive reflection of ideology, class location, but a production of ideology. And how does it produce ideology is by attempting to resolve some of the basic contradictions in the society. And contradiction in Marxism is a positive thing, right? It's not to be seen as a negative. And this idea comes from Hegel, that contradiction is a sign that there is a dynamism present, right? So one contradiction that Terry Eagleton talks about is between in the romantic thought, which emphasizes individualism on one hand and talks about a kind of organicism of society, whether it's Wordsworth or any romantic philosopher, has this kind of tension in their writing. That's a contradiction. You are talking of extreme form of individualism, but what you are upholding is a certain organic view of society. What do we mean by organic view of society is like how the society is viewed as a natural whole, right? As like body is made up of multiple organs. So society is also like human body. It has got multiple organs to it. Or like a tree, which has got trunk and which has got flowers and which has got fruits and all that. But it's one whole, right? So you find this idea in Coleridge, in Wordsworth, and so on and so forth. So how to resolve this contradiction between individualism and belief that society is one complete whole? Now, this is a contradictory idea, right? It's one of the problems that you find in Romanticism, which according to Marxist thinker is because of the class dynamics of the period, right? It emerges from class tensions. The aristocratic class wants a certain kind of agricultural kind of imaginings of society, right? Because it comes from feudal class. While the new bourgeoisie is individualist. But at the same time, this new bourgeoisie does not have the cultural capital or cultural wealth with it. And that's why it relies upon aristocratic thought for its intellectual wealth. Bourgeoisie cannot merely satisfy itself with material wealth. You also need intellectual, philosophical, cultural wealth, right? And this is where Matthew Arnold criticizes the materialism of bourgeoisie by calling it Philistines, right? It's Philistinism. He calls them Philistines because they are only interested in developing material wealth at the cost of high culture. So Matthew Arnold's project, according to Terry Eagleton, is coming up with the idea of culture, right? Culture. What is culture? According to Matthew Arnold, is this wealth of classical literature. Now that religion has subsided and materialism of bourgeoisie is on the rise, right? So he wants to appropriate aristocratic ideas of high literature for the bourgeoisie. That is his argument. But in doing so, he also wants to, in some way, impose his ideas or make his ideas hegemonic on the working class as well. Right? So that is the class politics of Matthew Arnold. Right? So this is how he analyzes Matthew Arnold. In context of, so he may be an individual, but his ideas have something to do with the class dynamism of his period. So this is a Marxist analysis of Matthew Arnold, and entire essay talks about this tension between individualism, bourgeois individualism, and organicism. All these writers, right? And he calls this tradition culture and society tradition, right, of English literature. So culture is a replacement for religion. Right now that religion has declined because of science, technology, and new materialistic utilitarianism of bourgeoisie. But Matthew Arnold believes that by throwing away religion, this class is also throwing away cultural values. So literature should come in the place. Classicism of certain kind should replace religion. That is Matthew Arnold's project of culture. And you have studied Matthew Arnold, that's why I'm just talking about it. So he analyzes all these authors in this manner. Right? So what I suggest is you may want to read it again after this discussion.
Yeah,
right?
maybe, yes. I think, yeah, it's much more clearer now. But like,
Right.
yeah.
Riddhi, anything
Huh.
that you have to ask because you have been trying to ask? Yeah,
Oh,
go ahead.
sorry.
No, sir. I mean, the discussion that we're doing right now, I'm just kind of taking it in because I was discussing with Shikha the other day about Eagleton's article, and I was going through it too, and it was like Shikha said, it was quite heavy. So I think after the discussion, if we like go through it, understand, they read a little bit upon Marxism, and then they read, the article, it will make much more sense because
Yeah,
at times, I mean, it just the understanding of, say, the concept or something, it just gets like very abstract, so you
yeah.
don't
Yeah,
you don't kind of you don't understand what the author is trying
Right.
to talk
to
about.
get out.
And
Yeah.
apart from abstraction, another problem is that he tends to make very sweeping generalizations.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Right. Now, that's the problem with Marxism. Means, uh, you, though however hard he tries not to be reductive,
Hmm.
it does end up being reductive by making several sweeping generalizations, which are not backed up by his analysis of text. Maybe this is part of his larger book, so elsewhere in his book, he may have elaborated upon certain things. That's
Yeah.
possible, right? But in the present chapter, he does not seem to elaborate upon certain statements that he has made in a sweeping manner.
Yeah.
So that is another problem with his writing.
And so like one more thing, I was like just reading upon it, and like I read that in a way he has sort of, I mean, about the whole reductive, if we're like on that topic, like how it has entirely become about how class is affecting the ideology, or class is affecting the literature that is affecting the ideology. And I think we discussed in a previous lecture that, class cannot be the only thing that contributes to the foundation of our ideology. So that is one thing that like irked me about his writing, that he was considering class and the literature to be the things like working towards the formation of ideology, or vice versa. And where I feel like, like we discussed in our last lecture, that our interactions with people over time, our ideologies are built that way. It's a more organic growth that way.
And he uses a term called over-determination throughout his writing. Now, this is another term used by Althusser, to complicate simplistic reductive relation between base and superstructure. Determination is kind of cause and effect. Because D.H. Lawrence is from working class, his writing will be of particular kind. Now, this is a kind of causal reductive reading, right? So he uses term over determination to emphasize that there are multiplicity of factors that develop that impinge upon person's worldview,
Okay.
right? So over determination is another term that he uses throughout his writing. That also comes from Althusser.
Okay.
And another problem that you might have faced is our understanding of Western English literature comes from very ahistorical way of understanding literature, right? So we are not really, we don't have that grasp over its historical context. So what is Jacobins, or who are what is Deism, right? Or what are those reform bills that he talks about? Now, all this history has to be dug up. Who is this Bishop John William Colenso that Matthew Arnold criticizes? What is Hebraism and Hellenism? So very often these things are part of English literature, and we have very ahistorical and superficial relation to literature. So we are not aware of these histories, for which we will have to dig up using Google. Because literature as we study it in India is very, very ahistorical, very often. So we don't understand, because we don't know the context, we have very general understanding of literature, rather than very specific, complex understanding of the text that we study. That is a problem, right?
And that is what happened, because I saw those terms Hellenism and I googled it, but because I've never studied it or heard about it, at least in my case.
Hellenism and Hebraism is the distinction coined by Matthew Arnold. There's this essay that you studied probably. Right.
So,
and he's saying Hellenism is a kind of rational thought based on clarity of your vision, while Hebraism is all about submitting to higher power and authority of God or social order or something. So Matthew Arnold is saying that we need to combine this, because what has happened because of French Revolution is that there is a kind of blind faith in reason. I'm just simplifying Matthew Arnold, right? And that leads to Jacobinism. Now, Jacobins were a group of people in French Revolution who went to extremes to implement rationalist views, right? And whoever did not agree with those rationalist views were killed, guillotined. And that is what is known as the Reign of Terror. And Robespierre was the important member of that group. So Jacobinism is something that is frowned upon by most of English writers after Wordsworth. Wordsworth and Coleridge, to begin with, were very enthusiastic about French Revolution. But as French Revolution moved into its later phases, where it was regressive and violent and despotic, they were disillusioned by it. Right? French Revolution is 1989 to 1999. I'm sorry, 1789 to 1799. Almost 10 years. It's not a one-time event. It was a kind of phases that it went through. And ultimately, Napoleon Bonaparte would come to power. And while French Revolution was happening, France invaded many countries, which also made Wordsworth extremely disillusioned with French people with whom he had solidarity first. Right? So Jacobinism that he talks about is his despotic faith in rationality that people like Robespierre, who themselves were guillotined later on the same place where they guillotined Louis XVI. So all these historical contexts are something that we should be
Yeah.
aware of. Like reform bills are those three bills throughout 19th century which seek to reform the electoral process. So the first bill opened up right to vote to people who were not aristocrats.
Uh-huh.
Right. The second reform bill opened it up to the bourgeoisie, and the third reform bill opened it up to voting rights were given to the workers as well. And that is towards the end of 19th century, 1880s something. So these reform bills is what created modern democracy in first place, and how it is shaped by class politics is what we need to understand. So when we study 19th century literature, we are not aware of these important historical developments that shape British society. And literature is one of the forces that shape society, right? That's the Marxist understanding. It's not mere reflection of ideology, but it is production of ideology as well. And what do you mean when you say you resolve something, contradiction in some form of imaginary or ideological domain? Is like, consider that love story that you used to find in the 80s and 90s in cinema, where the poor boy fell in love with rich girl and parents opposed it, and finally they were able to overcome the class divide and they lived happily ever after. Right? The parents' heart changed. So what is happening in the film is that the class tension is resolved in an imaginary fantasy land. For example, the racism and xenophobia in Britain is resolved in an imaginary domain called Hogwarts, where multicultural Britain is living happily, right? And the threat is from outside in form of Voldemort or whatever. But what it actually is resulting is in not people living happily ever after, but in Brexit, right? Which is built upon this kind of xenophobic racism. So, so culture offers a kind of imaginary fantasy solution to real problems. That's how they read. That is the Marxist take on. That's how Marxists read literature. So cinema itself is ideological. Why? Because it provides a kind of imaginary solution to real problems. Right? That a rich girl and a very poor boy can marry and live happily ever after, and the divide can be overcome by sheer power of love. Something that does not happen in
You're right.
real life. So that's how the contradiction, or caste, for example, or gender. So all these contradictions are resolved in a different domain. And this is how cinema becomes ideological in its own right. It is not a reflection of ideology, right? It is also providing a kind of solution to various real problems. It provides a kind of fake solution to real problems.
Yeah.
And it's just gross simplification, but by saying fake. But then yes, it is not so convincing, right?
It's not practical in
Right.
the current
Yeah.
world life situation. Yeah.
Yeah. So now you can read these essays
Yeah.
with a different understanding of it.
Yes.
Okay, those people who heard Tatsam, what is your take on this? Because you were not able to attend lecture on Marxism. So what do you get from today's conversation about Rohit, Khushi and Tatsam? Okay, anyone else has to say? Riddhi, anything to say?
So, so just a second. Okay. So, sir, I mean, about today's lecture, I think just that what I read on Eagleton and about explaining and understanding, say, the historical context. I'm so sorry, sir, for the background noise.
That's fine.
Please give me a second.
No, that's fine.
Okay, so understanding of the history, understanding of say a particular period of time, and in what and understanding the context
Is it stuck?
that makes
Oh.
sense when you understand the context, and when then if I read say if I go ahead and then read Marxism or Egerton for that matter. So I don't have to say anything, but I just think that touching up on the article or the essay again after the discussion will make sense. So even so, I understood. So we last semester we had modernism, and I had presented on Matthew Arnold. So when I read the particular piece about when Eagleton talks about Arnold, so that made sense to me because I had done extensive research on Arnold. But then when it came to say others, it did not make as much sense. So again, like I said, understanding how you understanding what we've done in class, and then also the historical context, and then going back and reading is it kind of helps us
Makes a difference.
add a saying and kind of developing our own critical argument of that paper. So
Right. So we are also learning how to read a complex essay like this. What kind of research it entails, right? So that is the purpose why. So I think Rohit, Tatsam, and Kushi also will read this essay and come tomorrow, right? And you can bring your doubts, not just Shikha when she makes presentation.
Okay.
Yeah,
So Tatsam is actually traveling right now, so he's in the bus right now. So is
okay,
that's
that's
why he
fine.
can't like speak.
Hmm.
Maybe, yeah.
Okay, but you have to read these essays and yeah, Rohit, go ahead. You have to say something. Yeah,
No, sir, I just wanted to say that yes, I will read tomorrow and I will come. Yes.
right. Okay. So, discussion on Marxism will continue tomorrow as well.
sir, I have one question.
Yeah, please go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Okay. So, sir, you had asked the question that what is the difference between hegemony and am I audible? Am I audible?
I think there's some problem with
No, I
your.
think there is some internet. I will let me type it in the
You can type that. That's better.
Okay.
chat box. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Hmm, hmm.
So while Riddhi is typing the
Yeah,
question,
yeah. You can ask.
so you had said in like before we start to present our essays that we should use a novel or a literary piece to like kind of implement what the essay talks about.
Yeah.
But can I actually do that with Terry Eagleton's essay?
Why,
Because
why not? Why not?
but how? I mean, that was another thing Riddhi and I were discussing, because I mean,
So
I could like do it with Marxism and Marxist thought that I have seen reflected in other novels, but then
that
okay, yeah, actually could
follow
do it. Yeah.
Egerton work in word, right?
Mm-hmm.
Literally, but more as a kind of in spirit.
Yeah, so like
No
I
need
could
to,
follow this.
yeah, follow it very closely. But
Yeah.
using your understanding of Marxism, you can analyze a novel.
Yeah, so I mean, is it okay? Like I have two novels in mind. I might speak about both of them, but one of them is the Game of Thrones series. I mean, I know it is not literature, but I do think it is a masterpiece with the way he has actually converted real history
Of a literary text, right?
of a
So,
literary text.
yeah,
Okay, so I mean,
Game
it
of
can't.
Thrones is an adaptation of a literary text.
I mean, yeah, yes. Okay,
Yeah.
so so should I go back to the like original one, or is it okay if I talk
Can
about?
analyze the film version as well. If you want to focus on film narrative, because we are looking at cultural narratives, not literature
Yeah.
in strict sense of the word as novel,
Okay.
but as a cultural text, as a cultural form. So you
Hmm.
can analyze it as a cultural text.
Okay. Okay, that was one question I had. Okay, okay,
Yeah,
I'll
you
do
can
that.
do that. Yeah, so Riddhi has asked, what is the difference between hegemony and dominance? But could tell us difference in a literary context. Hegemony is in some way trying to persuade. Maybe the intellectuals of bourgeoisie are trying to convince the intellectuals of working class about how their ideas are the best for them. Ideas of dominant class are the best for the ideas of dominated world. Means ideas of these are the best ideas, right? That is what we mean by hegemony. And literature can become a tool, or cultural text can become a tool because it does not impose the ideas, right? If book says that I am going to brainwash you and you have to accept what I say, then it becomes dominating. But if it has to become hegemonic, then it will make people agree with its ideas, right? So how does literature convince maybe the oppressed or the exploited section that these ideas are best for them, right? And good example of this would be Marxist understanding of religion, that religion teaches us to accept your place in society, not to question social order, to accept social structure as God given, God made. That's what religion teaches us, right? So when you are trying to persuade the working class that this is the best ideology, it means that the working class people won't rebel against the dominating class because of the belief that social order is divinely created and their place in society is given by their karma or whatever, right? That is what we mean by hegemony. So you convince the working class of the idea of karma and that idea that society is God made, so that your own place, privileged place in society, is uh, considered as natural and given. So when man persuades woman that your place is in four walls of the house, or that you are goddess, but then you are not supposed to do these things. You don't have these rights, right? Uh, you just have to follow the convention. Then that becomes hegemony. Men are not forcing women to do something, but they are persuading and convincing people to accept their place in society. So hegemony goes to naturalize social structures, especially the given hierarchies. So, hegemony is a kind of backdoor way of keeping status quo. Right? And very interestingly, Althusser defines ideology as a mode of reproduction of the material relations and its conditions. What are the conditions? Condition is the belief that the social order is given by God. Right? God has made man superior and woman inferior. For example, I'm simplifying just as an example in a very crude way. Right? Now, this is the condition for superior hierarchy, existing hierarchy. Right? What ideology does is to reproduce the condition of given social relation. So that is the function of ideology, according to Althusser. Right? And that is how it is hegemonic in that sense.
Yes.
Okay. So literary text is in service of hegemony, according to Marxist analysis. Literary text is not coercion. And followers of Gramsci, like and Althusser, like Michel Foucault, gives this very famous example that if a slave is tied to ball and chains and he cannot run away, that is called force. But if ball and chain in his feet are open and even then he does not run away, that is power. So he is making a distinction between force and power. Right? Power is when the slave refuses to run away even if his ball and chain are open. So that is what we mean by hegemony. Right? And the key theorists are Althusser and Gramsci, who influenced Michel Foucault. Okay, any more questions?
No, sir.
Okay, so we will be discussing these ideas throughout our semester because Marxism was, as your teacher pointed out, it's not a static thing but as a kind of dynamic movement of ideas, right? And you will find that when we discuss structuralism, then there is also Marxist, structuralist Marxism. When you read feminism, there is something like feminist Marxism, right? When you read post-structuralism, there is something like post-structural Marxism. And when you read something like new historicism, that is also some form which is which repeats some of the ideas that we have been discussing. So Marxism will remain in certain modified forms because many other, like new historicism is a critique of Marxism, but at the same time it builds upon it, some of its ideas, right? So Marxism is not a static thing, but a kind of dynamic thing where people use these ideas, modified it critically, like Terry Eagleton does in various historical contexts. So we will be continuing these ideas, but there is another current of ideas that we are going to talk about in 45 minutes that we have today. And that current of ideas is called psychoanalysis, something that has deeply influenced 20th century, right? So some of the ideas that corrupted 20th century, along with Marxism and Nietzsche, is psychoanalysis. Means you cannot go back to the period when there was no psychoanalysis and Marxism. right? That is the 20th century. This is the impact of these ideas in spite of rejections and in spite of critiques of Freud and Marx. You cannot simply bypass them without touching them, right? You cannot jump over and go back to pre-Marxist, pre-Freudian world of thinking, though you may not agree with maybe most of the ideas that they have said, given, right? So Freudian thought has left a deep impact on study of literature as well as writing. Just like Marxism influenced both creative writing, there were Marxist poets, novelists, and playwrights. It also psychoanalysis also inspired, influenced writers. D.H. Lawrence being the most popular case, who was deeply influenced by Freud. Right, so Marx and Freud are not simply methodological theories, but also philosophies that have influenced people's outlook to life as you find it in their writing, creative writing. So that is the importance of both these thoughts. Has anyone heard about Freud?
Yes, sir. I mean,
What are the things that you have heard? Nice things or bad?
I have like heard about his theories. My father had this book on him, on like his. It's a keep it simple, silly version of Freud's analysis. So like I just have read on the dream interpretations part. So like
Okay.
that's all I know. And I think we looked into him a little when we were doing Oedipus Rex. I mean, it was not part of the course, but we were doing a play in college, so we just read up a little on the whole Oedipal complex. So that is all I know.
Okay.
But yeah.
Anyone else has heard about Freud?
Oh yes, sir. Like we had it in our we had this course called film studies where we had some basic theories of Freud in films, and I'm also reading his book right now, The Interpretations of Dreams.
Which one? Interpretation of dreams.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay. Right. So why is Freudian thought so important, or what is it basically is what we will talk about. And we will be continuing what Freud has said throughout the semester, like we are going to talk about Marx, right? That is the importance of Freud. And Freud, interestingly, began in the domain of psychology and developed a school of psychology known as psychoanalysis. However, psychoanalysis today, though draws upon Freud, does not very literally follow him, right? There are many of his key ideas that are rejected, and psychology prefers to go beyond Freud in many ways. Psychology is no longer considers Freud as one of the most important influence on today's thinking about the very subjects that Freud was talking about, right? However, his influence is more felt on literature and philosophy and criticism and culture than the discipline in which he is working, that is psychology, right? So his influence is outside his discipline and has become a part of pop psychology at times, right? So that is the influence of Freud. And as students of literature and culture, we have to study and understand his ideas because they have deeply influenced writers as well as critics. So Freud began as a psychologist, but he was primarily a physicist. Physician who was working on diseases which did not seem to have physical basis. Right, diseases, as doctors knew, had their origin in physical conditions like germs and infections and virus and bacteria and congenital diseases. But there were certain diseases which did not seem to have its basis in any of these physical conditions of diseases. So his primary thrust of study was to uncover what gave rise to these diseases. And these diseases were labeled as neurosis in those days. It's not a single disease, but a range of disease, which includes something like hysteria, largely found in women, but it had certain kind of hysterical behavior pattern, and people thought that it has something to do with uterus. And Freud would say it would not. It does not have any kind of physical basis. So he is studying those diseases which do not have physical basis, right? Neurosis, and he is trying to uncover what is known as etiology. Etiology is account of how diseases are or how diseases happen, right? Causes of these diseases. So etiology, A-E-I-T-O-L-O-G-Y. So he is trying to provide an etiology of these diseases, and methods that he started working out with was hypnosis to start with, right? It was acceptable method in those days, and he started treating patients using hypnosis, but then he gave up hypnosis and developed his own methods of treating diseases, which has become a kind of revolutionary method in themselves. And those methods are something called free association. That means the patient keeps talking about whatever comes to her or his mind without the doctor telling him to think in a particular way. So keep talking randomly. Let words lead to words, ideas lead to ideas without having any logical or rational link. So free association method was something that Freud developed, and that's why it was called talking cure. And people used to feel better even by speaking in this kind of way. So psychoanalysts would sit besides him on the couch and just make notes without interrupting that person to speak, right? So this is the first method, free association. And second method was equally radical, was to analyze dreams. And you can see that both these methods are interpretative. Both are interpretation of verbal activity. And that is why these methods appeal to literary critic, because literary criticism is also in some way interpretation of verbal texts, words, right? So dream interpretation and free association were the methods he preferred over hypnosis, slowly. And what he discovered was that these diseases which do not have their basis in physical condition have something to do with what is there in human unconscious mind. Means those aspects which are not part of your awareness right now, but they are still part of your mind. You don't know that they exist. You are unconscious. They are beyond your conscious. Or if you are vaguely aware of it, he calls it subconscious. So there are things beyond human awareness, right? Consciousness, which seem to influence this behavior, these diseases like hysteria or like tics. People have this habit of playing with pen or shaking their feet, or many kinds of diseases that neurosis leads to, of all kinds, right? And these behavioral patterns are influenced by something beyond the pale of human consciousness, right? And that is one of the major discoveries of Freud's as a doctor. Now, people were aware of unconscious before Freud, like Schopenhauer or like Nietzsche, but they did not see human being they did not look at human being in that scientific method which Freud did. Right? So he scientifically discovers unconscious. That is one very important aspect of Freud's theory. So unconscious is that aspect of your mind which is beyond your awareness or beyond your consciousness right now. Right? Then how do these things go into that unconscious domain is also something that you have to explain. And he used the term called repression to define the mechanism by which things move out of your conscious mind but are part of your unconscious mind. Consider when you were playing in the school and you got injured. It hurt for a moment, but then you forgot about it, right? It disappeared in your game. And when you sat down after the game, then slowly the pain started again. So it was there, but it was out of your awareness, right? So things going out of awareness is called repression. It is not to be confused with suppression. Suppression means you are trying to force your thoughts to go away, and that never happens. You can never remove your thoughts. Right? More you try to remove your thoughts, more stronger they tend to become. So suppression is not repression. Repression is that natural mechanism through which your unpleasant experiences go away from your awareness. Now they don't go anywhere. They are still part of your unconscious, according to Freud. The problem starts when these things start coming back into your unconscious mind. And this is what he calls the return of the repressed. Right? And return of the repressed causes neurosis. That is very simple explanation of why such diseases happen. Now, today's medical science does not believe in most of these ideas. Right? For today's medical science, they would rather rely on neuroscience to explain some of this disease, or neurochemistry, right? Or even cognitive training, right? So there is something called REBT, or rational emotive behavior therapy in psychology, which tries to train people to think rationally about their life, right? And that kind of cognitive process is something that today's psychology would lay more importance to, rather than help people overcome the return of the repressed, right? Which Freud tried to do. So Freud tried to treat people by helping them to come to terms with this returned things, the returned material. One more.
Sorry for disturbing.
No, not any.
This is to Shivam.
Right.
Not to Shivam, but it's to the director.
Right. So you have to write that.
Yeah, just to support the case.
What's the date today?
Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm disturbing.
Not an issue.
Is going out of town.
No.
So I have to get the signature.
You also need to get it stamped.
Yeah, I'll get it stamped and I'll put it. The dean office in the history department.
Oh, God, you will walk all the way.
I'm going by car, so I was.
But can you take car to?
No. I have to go home.
You have to pass it.
I have to go home. Because I have to put a stamp on that.
Closer to your
No. I have to repeat this plus exam. Okay.
Yeah.
So I will go and get.
No, you will clear it next time. It's not such a not complex.
I didn't study for. So you can see. Pardon?
Triple C plus.
What it is a number of other things. Sorry for this.
Yeah, not an issue at all. Yeah. So we were discussing what he terms as etiology of illness, right? So these kind of illnesses which do not have somatic basis or physical basis are what he wants to treat. And according to him, it's when you are unable to repress certain unpleasant memories, they start coming back to you. Now, the question is, if some part of unpleasant experiences you have forgotten, right? Forgetting is a positive mechanism in Freud, right? You have to forget in order to live. Otherwise, you won't be able to live. It's a basic survival strategy of human mind. So forgetting does not happen, right? Then the question is, who is the person who forgets? Right? So the term that he uses is the Latin term ego or self, who tries to forget things. Right? Why? Because those things are unpleasant to some part of his thinking. Something which he calls superego. Right? So there is ego and superego. Superego does not like what has happened. Right? And that's why superego wants to forget many things. And ego is trying to cope up with this returned material and superego, right? Both of them are trying to cancel each other out. And this conflict is what ego cannot handle. And function of psychoanalysis to strengthen ego to help that person overcome this conflict between superego and repressed material that has come back. Now, on basis of verbal association and dream analysis, he reached the conclusion that most of the things that you are trying to forget have something to do with sexual desire, desire for physical pleasure. Right? And that is what he calls pleasure principle. So pleasure principle is human innate orientation to get pleasure out of physical existence, body, basically. So sex is not to be understood merely as sexual intercourse in Freud. Sex would mean everything that is governed by pleasure principle. So this broadening of definition of what is sexual is what Freud is accused of very often. That if you love eating a particular thing, that is also sexual because it gives you pleasure, right? So everything that is given by pleasure principle is sexual in his definition. And what drives this sexual orientation or sexual, what should I say, behavior is something which he calls libido or life force. So you have a range of terms that we have discussed: unconscious, repression, ego, superego, pleasure principle, and libido, right? So what happens is this pleasure principle, and this is where Freud actually is going to a thinker who is not so closely associated with Freud, but a deep influence on human society, called Charles Darwin. So Freud is Darwinist, right? So he's talking about survival value of forgetting. And he's also talking about libido as life force, which is also about propagation of species, continuation of species, and so on and so forth. Life force, right? And most of its behavior, those bad things that you're trying to forget have happened in the first 6 years of your life, right? And very often in first 3-4 years that these things have happened. And you can see why you don't remember them. Because forgetting those things, according to Freud, is the basis of your growing up. Otherwise, you would have not lived to grow up to the age where you have, right? So forgetting is necessary for survival of an individual. And what are those things? Then those are the conflicts which are produced by incestuous desires, right? Desire for incestuous relationship and desire for pleasure. And when a child or infant is born, then the first source of pleasure for that child is mouth. And relation of mouth and mother's breast is the first site of pleasure for child. And you can see how deeply it's connected for the existence of the species. If child does not suckle, then it won't live, right? Artificial milk is a recent invention. For thousands of years, the species has survived because of this primary thing. So there is a kind of evolutionary payoff to pleasure. So pleasure governs this site. And then anal area, rectum is the site of pleasure for a very small infant. And the third, as the infant grows up, is male penis. Right? So penis or genital penis becomes the next site of pleasure when small infant touches oneself. Right? And then it has to then go to genital phase. Now this phase of human existence, first few years, is what Freud calls psychosexual development of human beings. This is the first phase of psychosexual development, where these are the sites of pleasure which stay with a person throughout their life, but it has to be on move. And this phase of genital sexuality then goes into latency. That means you don't remember that you had sexual pleasure of touching oneself till you reach puberty, right? So there is a gap between first few years and then when you achieve puberty in 11, 12 years. Now the problem with Freud's account is that he seems to be largely talking about men and male, right? And for him, women and girls are also follow the same pattern almost. And that is a problem over which feminists have attacked Freud, that his account of psychosexual development is largely male-centric and patriarchal. And ironically, feminists have drawn upon Freud substantially later on to build their theories, right? Something which is so patriarchal in its nature. So what happens in these first few years is that when child reaches an age where penis is the site of pleasure, he feels threatened by other males, especially his father. And he feels that the other male, that is father, is in competition or rivalry with him. And this is the phase of Oedipal conflict. And he is drawing upon a very old play called Oedipus Rex, which you studied or performed, right? And Oedipal is about desire for mother as a site of pleasure and seeing father as a threat. Now this threat perception grows to an extent that the child is afraid that his father may castrate him. Now that all this sounds fairly dirty enough for us. So this gives rise to something called castration anxiety. Now, when the child goes over to latency period, all these conflicts have to be repressed. And by repression, we don't mean suppression, right? In fact, if you try to suppress, then it won't get repressed. You keep remembering things that you deliberately want to forget, right? So it's a paradoxical power of forgetting. You forget things that you don't want to forget, or forgetting is a kind of mechanism that is required for survival. So in many cases, this works. This whole forgetting of castration anxiety and Oedipal conflict is repressed. So no one, according to Freud, who is healthy remembers this. Right? So if you think that all this is nonsense because you don't remember it yourself, is because according to Freud, you are healthy and you have repressed this. Right? You should not be remembering this for your own sanity. Because of incest taboo, which is internalized by our super egos, the rational component of our mind that is based on our parent superego. So we inherit the prejudices from our parents very often, right? Or a kind of norms from our parents. And this, so we have internalized the parent component in our mind. So this parent does not want the child within you to express sexual conflicts and desires. I think Lalji Sial has joined us midway. But I will wind it up in 10 minutes and maybe she can hear or he can hear the recording of our class. So what happens here is that when these repressed things start coming back, people have neurosis, behavioral disorders. So how did Freud find out that these are the contents of human unconscious? He did it by analysis of the dreams and the free association that people did, the kind of talking that was rambling talk. So he discovered that in your dreams, these mechanisms are at work. Superego does not want these conflicts and desires to re-emerge. That's why the superego, which is slightly relaxed in sleep, and that is the evolutionary payoff of sleep, that you sleep so that the moralist within you, the obsessive thinker, judger is given rest so that you can get back your energy and be fresh. But these dreams have to pass through this half asleep sensor of ego and superego. It's half asleep. It's asleep, but it's not completely asleep. Right? So it is transformed in some other way. So dreams are either symbolic or they have something called condensation. That means some of the events which are unrelated can be fused together. For example, you may see your current teacher, but the classroom may be your 8th standard class, for example, in your dream. Right? That is called condensation. Or it may be displacement. That means one problem or one conflict is seen as something else. It is deflected onto something else. And dream symbolism reveals this incestuous sexual conflicts of a person. So according to Freud, dream is symbolic of unconscious conflicts. So the examples that he gives is like, you see fruits, then they may be symbol of mother's breasts, for example. Or cave may be symbol for genitals. Or a spear or an arrow may be a phallic symbol or symbol for male genital, and so on. right? That is how it may reveal. And very often nightmares may be transformation of your castration anxieties and so on and so forth. And you can see how deeply masculinist or sexist this is. Freud goes on to argue that men and women do not actually undergo very different process of psychosexual development, which is a very controversial position. And he argues that women have something called penis envy, or envy for male phallus, which offended later feminists a lot, right? And that causes repression. So when a small girl sees a boy with penis, then she is jealous of him, and so on and so forth. So that is the kind of account that he has given. Now, what is interesting for students of literature is that many writers were influenced by this idea of unconscious. And Freud went on to argue that literature is also an embodiment of unconscious conflicts, sexual conflict, incestuous conflicts, which are transformed by superego and ego. And he, in his essay called Creative Writers and Daydreaming, he draws parallel between how daydreaming or fantasizing is one of the ways of fulfilling your wishes. When you fantasize, you are actually fulfilling your unconscious wishes. So literature also is a form of wish fulfillment. That's why the pleasure that you get from watching films or reading novels or poems, because your unconscious wishes are fulfilled. And you know what unconscious wishes are, right? Incestuous or to murder daddy, right? Or that is expression of aggression towards father, to put it in more complex terms. So daddy, mommy, me is the triangle. First love triangle is, and that's why love triangles are so popular, because they enact this infantile love triangle that human beings have. And that's why people love to watch this romantic love triangles, right? And and writers found a lot of material, and they started devising techniques for writing which used Freudian methods like stream of consciousness, free association. So James Joyce would use free association as a method for writing. Or surreal poets, surrealism tried to overcome the rationalist view of the world and life, and tried to achieve the irrationality of human dreams in their writing, and nightmares and whatever. So the irrational stuff that you find in surreal or Dadaist poetry is reveals Freudian influence of his ideas. Critics found it very interesting because it's a method of interpretation, right? What Freud is talking about is nothing less than interpretation of a text, verbal text. And they also looked at how dream work and literary text or a cultural text or a film have similar mechanisms of symbolism, condensation, and displacement, revealing repressed desires, right? So dream work is the term he uses to talk about how latent dream content, which is unconscious desires and conflicts, are converted into dream texts that you see, the stories that you find yourself witness to in your dreams. Dreams are, after all, narratives, right? So anything that you have to say about these ideas?
And they're interesting.
Yeah, and
So, I mean, I did like I did read. Yeah, so when we're talking about the Oedipus and the Electra complex, so I've read up on that. So, like, no questions on that. I mean, I had to read it, so like I kind of knew about that. But yeah, I mean, it is intriguing more than interesting. It is intriguing.
yeah. Freud's influence is found in later structuralist interpretation of Freud, given by a French psychoanalyst called Jacques Lacan, Lacan, right? And later there is a Freudian school which flourished, which modified Freud's ideas in several ways, right? For example, his student Jung uh, and his colleague took it in different direction, arguing that unconscious is not merely individual, but it is racial or species. It has something to do with entire human species and brain. It does not have anything to do primarily with individual unconscious. And that's why you find many patterns which are universal, right? Uh, So folk tales, religious symbolism, myths embody such patterns which are part of collective unconscious of human race. That's what Jung argued, and he called these patterns as archetypes. Like Oedipal complex is an archetype, Electra complex is an archetype, and Electra complex talks about desire to kill mother, right? Rivalry with mother. And the jealousy, penis envy, and all that. Other scholars like Adler would take it in another direction. He would be influenced by Nietzsche and would argue that the whole human life is about overcoming your inferiority complex, right? Because when child is born, it's very small and helpless, and world is big and dangerous, and that becomes a kind of first trauma that stays with you throughout your life. Your whole life you're trying to get power over the world and your life, right? And that is a kind of Nietzschean interpretation of Freud. Then people like Erik Erikson would take Freud in a different direction and focus on things like self-actualization by reducing emphasis on sexuality. So all these later thinkers seem to reduce emphasis on sexuality from Freud. And then later on, people like in contemporary period, you have people like Eric Berney, whose very famous method is called transactional analysis, or TA. Uses some psychoanalysis as its basis. And I don't know if you have heard of a book called The Games People Play. Right? So he analyzes the games people play using psychoanalytic template. TA, or transactional analysis. So these are some of the later developments in Freud. And it has deeply influenced literary criticism in its interpretation of literary texts as if they are dreams and the author is the patient. And one very famous example is a psychoanalyst working under Freud called Ernest Jones, who interpreted Hamlet's procrastination, right? Why does Hamlet procrastinate killing Claudius? I don't know if you're aware of story of Hamlet, right? So why does he keep on putting off killing his uncle? Because deep within, his uncle has done what he himself wanted to, and that is to kill his father, right? And his uncle is a kind of, he has identified himself with uncle. So killing his uncle would be amount to killing himself. And that's why he keeps on postponing his plan to murder Claudius. And he has, and in many later interpretations of Hamlet, you find a kind of extra representation of intimacy between the mother and Hamlet, very often, like Heather, for example. And that is influenced by Ernest Jones' interpretation of Hamlet. So that's a classical psychoanalysis. So just like you have classical or vulgar Marxism, you have vulgar classical psychoanalysis and later developments in psychoanalysis, right? Towards end of his career, Freud started dealing with big themes like religion and civilization, especially after World War. And he wrote a book called Civilization and Its Discontent, where he proposes existence of something called thanatos, or death instinct, desire for aggression that is innate in human species. Aggressiveness and violence is instinctual in Freud. So you may inflict it on yourself or someone else. So on one hand, you have libido or life instinct, but you also have thanatos or death instinct. But he was not able to extensively lay out his idea of death instinct. And both life instinct and death instinct are part of that part of unconscious that you call it, it. In German, it is id, id. Yani it is part of yourself, but you don't know it. It's not you, it is it. Right? So there is a split between you and it. And Freud claimed that he has done something revolutionary by displacing human conscious self as a driver of one's life and human life in general. That is, human conscious self is displaced. So he says that three people laid blow on human ego. First was Copernicus, who said that sun does not go around the earth goes around the sun. That was an ego to men's self. The second blow was given by Darwin, who pointed out that human beings are not essentially different from other animals. And third, according to him, was given by himself, by displacing human self and putting it at the center of human life. So your life is not run by you, but it. Some Indian psychoanalysts have tried to modify these ideas to Indian context. And one important person is Sudhir Kakar, K-A-K-A-R, who largely uses Ericksonian framework. And he has written on Gandhi, Vivekananda, and others, and also communal violence in India. So you may want to look up books by Sudhir Kakar. Okay, so 5 minutes are left before your next class begins.
No, sir, we don't have any. I mean, at least the me and Chika were in sociology, so we don't have any minor.
We will stop here.
I don't know.
And if you have any doubts, queries about psychoanalysis or Marxism, you can bring it up tomorrow. Right? We meet at 1. And Shikha will make a presentation.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so have a good day.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
You too, sir. Thank
And
you.
if you have recordings of today's lecture, you can just forward it to me. And recording on Marxism earlier, also you can just forward it to me if you have recordings.
Yes, I think Tatsam recorded the previous class and Krish is recording today. So
Yeah. so that
Yes, sir, I'll forward it to you.
I can use it elsewhere wherever I have to teach these things.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Have a good day.
You too, sir.